Hello, we are picking up the story of Rome after the Flavian emperors. And in lesson 35, lecture 1, we talked about, in particular, Nerva, the first emperor following. But the most important figure already under Nerva's reign was the emperor Nerva had to adopt, whose name is Trajan. And he became sole emperor, or the emperor as such, in the year 98 after Nerva died under completely natural circumstances. And some of the sort of new aspects of Trajan's rule were that, first of all, he was originally not from Italy, but he instead came from Spain, even though he descended from Italians, which nevertheless gives us an idea of how the empire is expanding its sort of geographical self-understanding. And secondly, Trajan is probably the most military emperor and certainly the most successful one that we see under the Roman Empire. And so, in some sense, the most important thing to learn about Trajan as a military leader was that the Roman Empire reached its greatest expansion under his rule. This included, in particular, an expansion in this area of Dacia in Arabia, and then further towards the east against Parthia. And even though what we will find is that some of these territories, for example, Mesopotamia, will not be sustainable. The Romans essentially will expand into it and then have to withdraw after Trajan's death. It nevertheless shows us sort of the military might that Trajan's rule meant everywhere around the Roman Empire. Now, I'm going to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about the Roman military under the empire, and there are a few key talking points here that I definitely want you to remember. First of all, the last time we talked in detail about Roman soldiers, it was during the civil wars, where we saw essentially a very open-ended recruitment, the willingness to take people who had absolutely no money and promise them essentially something like part of the booty, and if we are successful, they're going to have a lot of money, and then you can take that home and maybe settle down, which was not a sustainable model for the Roman military beyond the Civil War period. In fact, one of the things we learn about Augustus is that in about 4 years after the Battle of Actium, so by the time he reached 27 and the first attempt at constitutional consolidation, he reduced the size of the Roman army by about 50%. So essentially what he is doing, he's taking soldiers and he's settling them down in various parts of the Roman Empire. And the point of this is that he really did not want people around who you could easily hire to fight for you. The idea is that instead, those people are settled, they are not wanting to fight again. And so it really provides a tool for stabilizing the empire and avoiding further civil wars. And so I think there are two P words that I want you to remember in the context of how the Roman military changes then, starting with Augustus and beyond. And the first P word is professionalization, which is a word that we usually use today to describe when people get sort of very specifically focused on certain areas of life. You could professionalize into becoming a lawyer or doctor or something like that. And that it's a very sort of becoming increasingly technical and specific. And what it means in terms of the Roman army is that in the year 6 CE, Augustus established a special military treasury, which included a particular tax that was used to sort of fund it. But more importantly, it also included the development of a system in which soldiers were, essentially all soldiers, were required to serve a set number of years. So there are two kinds of Roman soldiers in this period. There are the legions, which are usually Roman citizens serve in them, and they have to serve 20 years. And auxiliaries who often are less, socially less advanced when they sign up, or that's the only place they can get, they serve about 25 years. Now, that's a lot of years to serve, but what it means is essentially some people will specialize into becoming soldiers, right? That's going to be their job. It becomes like a job description. And so we will find that then after you serve 20 or 25 years, you get a nice payout. And so there is essentially a pension system even attached at the end. And what that will leave us with is sort of this very professional army in which I think there is much more orientation towards maintaining whatever is currently existing. Hey, I get a paycheck, right? I don't want my system to be messed up, in contrast to the kind of much more unstable type of situation like we saw in the late Republic, right? Where soldiers were sort of available for the highest bidder. The second P word is provincialization. So traditionally, Roman soldiers could come from any part of the empire, but many of them came from Italy. And what we will see is that as the empire progresses, this is definitely visible already under the Julio-Claudian emperors, is that increasingly there is a lot of local recruitment for average soldiers. And they also often then stay in their local area. So they would recruit people who are sort of from Gaul to serve in Gaul, or, and then they would stay there. There are sometimes slightly different systems, like a lot of Spanish soldiers, for example, serve in Britain. But the main point that's important to us is that often these people essentially have a very settled life almost in terms of their military service. Now, this is true for your average soldier. However, the officer class, centurions and up, so these are the leaders, the various levels of commanders, they move around a lot, and they are much more sort of professional, and they're less locally connected. So I think that's an interesting sort of system, but the important aspect of that is that there is a lot of locals being recruited, and that's something to keep in mind as we will think about what this Roman army is really like. In sum, though, the biggest change is a shift in function, if you wish, which is traditionally the Roman military was a representative of the will of the Roman people, right? So the idea was if the soldiers were supposed to stand for Rome and its desire to conquer, versus now it's mainly about the protection of the reputation of the emperor, right? So we want to make sure not to lose because Augustus will be pissed, which is a very different proposition. Now, one of the biggest debates in Roman military history under the empire is called the grand strategy debate. And it goes back to the work of a Roman historian by the name of Edward Luttwak, who essentially said that Rome, in fact, had a grand strategy, which were defensive strategies. And they've evolved from under Augustus and sort of the development of the empire to client states and very mobile armies, to the increasingly preclusive defense and scientific frontiers, which is sort of would suggest sort of a much more strategic consideration about how to protect the empire. So, for example, we will see that the rivers are very critical as sort of a boundary in the Roman imagination in this period. And then later on in the mid-3rd century, when we will see there will be a major military crisis with break-ins from barbarian tribes, we will see a different strategy. Now, in contrast to Luttwak, we have another Roman historian who essentially said, Benjamin Isaac said, well, this is fantastic, except the Romans never talk about this. We do not have any evidence. So we don't find that the Romans would be saying like, well, we have this grand strategy and that's what we are going to do. And also he said that in fact, it is the case that the Romans usually, when they talk about things, they don't talk about defense. They usually talk about offense and aggression. So I think that the idea here is that they would not want to set up a strategy of defense. They would set up a strategy of offense. And the last bit that Benjamin Isaac suggested was that, in fact, the Romans never had like the kind of grand scheme, right? It was like institutional decision making very haphazardly. Okay, we have a crisis in this part of the empire, we're going to deal with that. How can we deal with that there? In contrast to having like, okay, this is the thing we're going to do from Britain to Syria. And I think maybe the part that to me seems most important, and it's quite relevant to Trajan's rule, is that Rome generally still wanted to be represented and thought of as sort of being very scary, right? So overawing and terrorizing are the terms that Susan Madden used, but the idea is that they definitely want to sort of have a sense of expansion and aggression. Now, the reason this debate makes any sense at all, and sort of why it erupted, which my students are sometimes like, well, you know, why does this matter, is that if this is a close-up map of the northern part of the empire in Germany, and what these little boxes are Roman forts. And the technical term that we use to describe this boundary is limes, and which is a wall or a moat. One of the things that we are trying to understand is why it is that in this period we have so much evidence for these small fortifications established everywhere around sort of the tricky boundary in Germany. And so the question is this a very elaborate defense strategy system? Now, the people who disagree with Luttwak, what they would say about that is that partially this is also an outcome of this provincialization, because what happens is that quite a few of the soldiers, in fact, come from areas close to these boundaries, and they also often then do a lot of trade across these boundaries. And so we might want to think, based on the archaeological evidence, about this as a boundary zone rather than a wall. You know, this is not the Great Wall of China type of thing. And also, even when we have those walls that seem like, you know, like, for example, in Britain, we will observe a wall under later Roman emperors. In fact, those walls don't really serve as a sort of trying to stop the break-ins, but much more they are places from which the Romans then can venture out into the territory beyond, right? So they would use this as the fallback place, and then they can venture out. I think the sum of the debate, as far as I am concerned, or where I stand on it, is that I think that definitely the Romans embrace a more aggressive policy in general. Even emperors who are not super militaristic would want to be thought of as sort of very successful potentially militarily. And that's why, for example, Nero is such an interesting exception. And that's definitely that aggressive and militaristic image is incredibly powerful under Trajan, who has a number of things sort of going for him in terms of the military. My favorite one by far is that he is the rare emperor, and we really haven't seen anybody quite like this since Julius Caesar, who calls his soldiers my excellent and most loyal fellow soldiers, which is just such a beautiful way of putting the idea that we are in this together. He also established 2 new legions and marched with the army during these wars that he participated in, which sort of really put Rome back on the map of sort of thinking about being aggressive and expanding. Now, there are a number of wars, and these are also all listed on your handout, but I like to use a map when I explain sort of how these Dacian wars, and then the province of Arabia, and then the various Eastern conquests, what they look like. And you also have this map on your handout, because I think it's a really good explanation for how things unfold chronologically speaking. So early in Trajan's reign, he will attack Dacia twice and will succeed in creating a new province. Remember, Dacia is the place where they had a lot of gold, so that's part of the appeal. From there, making an almost full half circle, his next area of expansion is Arabia here in the year 106. But then, leaving Rome in 113, he will essentially go against Armenia, then Assyria and Mesopotamia, expanding as far as the town of Ctesiphon in 117, giving us a sense of a grand eastern sort of expansion and really coming up against the Parthians who are here on the east, and who will remain, incidentally, a key enemy of Rome throughout the second and third centuries. Maybe the one point I would want to make about the Parthians at this time is that, in fact, Trajan's break-ins did reach the Parthian territories, and in a way, therefore, made the situation worse than it was before. But this was not, again, the territory that Rome could not maintain. Later in its history, the Parthian Empire is called Persian Empire. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of the chronology. So where we pick up in the next lecture, we're going to talk about sort of how this what this fighting looks like, because in the case of Trajan, we have unique evidence to discuss what exactly war looks like, or at least what Trajan would want us to think war looks like during his reign.